Welcome to Pressure Point. My name is Patricia Wilensky, and I am a psychologist practicing in Vancouver and teaching psychology at UBC. It gives me great pleasure to welcome my guest, Vilma Dubé, because she is interested in a topic very dear to my heart as well, and that's the topic of racism and stories. Vilma was a school teacher in Nanaimo, and although born in Trinidad, she taught Native Indian children in Nanaimo and the poor, and became very interested in how the stories and the myths that we learn in the schools actually keep us missing. Vilma, welcome to Pressure Point.
Thank you.
You know, Vilma, you and I are both products of colonialism. Mm-hmm. Me in Belfast and you in Trinidad. Mm-hmm. What's your sense of how colonialism eats away at the self?
I think that it defines the self in a way that is alien by imposing a different reality. In fact, by destroying. It starts off by destroying what is there and imposing a foreign value system and self-concept. It's an insidious erosion mm-hmm. of the self. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting that you say that you have experienced it. Mm-hmm. We think only of the third world as having gone through the colonial process, but there you are mm-hmm. in Belfast having experienced mm-hmm. the imposition of one culture and one way of life upon another. And this year we celebrated is hardly the word, the fifth quincentenary, the quincentenary rather, of the contact between the so-called old world and the so-called new world. Mm-hmm. And it gave us a whole lot to think about. Mm-hmm. That probably was the most historic event in human history mm-hmm. up to this point. Mm-hmm. That event in 1492, mm-hmm. which defined so many things. Mm-hmm. I remember John Berger once when he was given the Booker Prize. And when he was accepting the prize, this would be about 18 years ago, but it struck me so much I remembered it. He donated the money back to Guyana because Booker made their money in Guyana, as you probably know. Mm-hmm. And he said that he talked about that event 500 years ago when the two worlds faced each other, the two groups of people, with the amazement of potential equals. Mm-hmm. And it was such a moment in history mm-hmm. that could have gone to enrich both. And the moment was lost.
The moment was lost.
And instead, they both proceeded to dehumanize
yes.
each other. But he was hopeful because he felt that that wasn't the end of the story, mm-hmm. that it's there, it's still there to be healed, and it could be done again. Mm-hmm. That we do in fact have another chance, mm-hmm. and maybe we could do it right this time.
Well, it seems as if people like you and me aren't represented in these stories.
Yes, I know what you mean, because we, for instance, grew up on probably the same English curriculum you grew up.
I think
you
we did. We
grew up
learned
on.
the history of India rather than the history of Ireland.
You learned the history of India.
Yes.
But again, you would have learned the history of India from the very British point of view.
Oh, absolutely.
which is how I would have learned it, such as the Black Hole of Calcutta.
Yes, which is where Indian history started
Yes.
from the British point of view.
That's right. And but people of the West Indies, in order to survive, perhaps developed a lot of mechanisms, and their own stories were never totally wiped out. And that may be true also of Ireland. I don't know. For instance, African stories. You probably have heard the Anansi stories.
Yes.
Which, even though the slaves who were brought out to the West Indies had lost a lot of their language because of the policy of dividing them up on different plantations, still there was enough memory somehow of the African stories which have come into the national psyche in a way. And similarly, the people who came from India kept some of their stories. Of course, a fairly large number became Christian. And it was unfortunate that Christianity got so identified with the colonial enterprise that in order to be a good Christian, one was expected to give up many things that were part, say, of the Indian heritage,
Yes.
in my case, and say adopt English names,
Yes.
which certainly was not necessary, but it's perhaps understandable that people who are involved in a missionary enterprise would reflect the times they live in
And their gender. I have a sense that it was very male-oriented. Like I remember that story you told me about grandmother God.
Well, you know, it at the time it didn't strike me, and it's we were writing for the World Council of Churches had instituted a program whereby they were encouraging the Caribbean Council of Churches to write their own Christian education curriculum. And I was invited to be one of the writers and to be on the editorial board, as a matter of fact. And we spent a lot of time deciding what was the content and how we wanted to do it. We would use Bible stories, but we would put it in native context if it was to be relevant. And so I was writing a unit which was about God's love. And I was doing the story in which Jesus is supposed to be telling people about God's love. And I said, well, Jesus said, you know how much your grandmother loves you? Well, that's as near as can get to telling you about the love of God. And there was an American woman on the committee who had been a missionary in one of the Caribbean regions. She was horrified. God could never be like a grandmother, she said. God is a father. It says so. And I said, yes, that's what Jesus said in those times, and it probably was a good image. But do you really think if Jesus was sitting here in the West Indies today, he would tell kids, God is like your father? If we are looking at society from Jamaica right down to Trinidad, there are lots of kids to whom that will not be relevant. Society has been so fractured by slavery that some kids wouldn't even know who their father is for a start. And some kids, this father might come home drunk, or he might be a stepfather, he might beat you up. Is that what God is? Is that what you want to tell the kids God is like? So that was my reasoning, and I had certainly never heard the word feminism. To me, it was just common sense. And but she was very horrified about it, and then she proceeded to tell me about, you know, her father. And I said, look, we're not writing this for you. We're writing this for in a particular context, and it has to be relevant.
Well, you were putting yourself into the story, and that was a problem.
Well, I guess so. you know, and it was not acceptable.
Yes. When you got to Nanaimo the long way, because you went from Trinidad to Toronto and then you went back to Trinidad and then you came to Nanaimo. And when you were teaching in the schools in Nanaimo, did you notice the same sense of missing self there in the children?
Well, I think I was very lucky in that my teaching experience was in a school in Nanaimo that originally served the reserve, but it's since then been integrated. And about half of the kids I taught did come from the Indian Reserve. It was great for me. It was a wonderful opportunity for me to really get to know more about Native. I would never otherwise, living in Nanaimo, have got to know this. And what struck me was when the kids came into school straight from home, how good, how solid they were, what a strong feeling they had about themselves. I remember one little boy saying to me when I said, well, you go into the courtroom and take off your shoes and put on your slippers. And he said, I ain't gonna. And that was it. He ain't gonna. And, you know, I just let him be, and eventually he joined our group and so on. But
he had a sense of himself.
He wasn't going to have me tell him what to do. He was a very strong little boy, and I remember that. And I remember another little boy who happened to have had a speech defect, and I had him being seen by the speech therapist. And the speech therapist would say to him, say plate, and he's trying really hard, and he's saying, say, no, look at my lips, say it, and he's trying really hard, and he couldn't say it. And finally, the little boy got so disgusted, he got up, his jacket was hanging around his little chair. He was only 5. He picked up his jacket, and he said, no way, white man, and he walked out. It was hilarious. I thought it was just great. Well, the speech therapist didn't think it was great. He thought I had some really bad kids in my class. But now, what was interesting to me was to watch these same kids as they went through the system.
And lose that.
By the time they got to grade 3 and grade 4 and grade 5, they were almost apologizing for the fact that they existed. And I felt, you know, I couldn't help feeling so sad about it, because these kids were coming into the system so strong, with such a strong self-concept, and we were slowly eroding it as we were going through the system.
I often feel that when I look back on my education, that there was a lot of shaming went on. I often felt ashamed of who I was, and it hurt my heart, really, to think that I had to be ashamed that I was from Northern Ireland, that I was from Belfast, you know, that I was sort of on a lower level, really, from the people who were teaching me. Do you have that sense too with those children that you were teaching?
Well, I think it may not be just the school system, it's everything. It's the whole society. I mean, they would want to play cowboys and Indians, and I'd say, well, what happens in Cowboys and Indians? Oh, well, the cowboys kill the Indians. And I said, well, why? Oh, because they're Indians. And the Indian kids are telling me this, you know. They were already accepting that role.
Yes, they'd identified with it already.
That's right. And it wasn't just the school system, it's the movies that we grow up on, and, and all that.
I do have a sense that we do need to redefine those stories, that we need to
reclaim them.
Yes. Like, I loved that story that you told me about Adam and Eve. You reclaimed Adam and Eve.
Well, I sort of, I took some, what should I say, poetic license with the story. I was struck by the fact, I guess I was listening to a Swedish woman who had worked in Ladakh, and she commented on the fact that when she first went there, she's been there for about 14 years, she was saying that she asked one of the people in Ladakh, I want to see some of your poorer houses. And he looked at her in astonishment, and he said, we don't have any poor houses here. And I mean, they may have had houses with mud walls and thatched roofs, but there were no poor houses there. they had a really good, rich life. They grew wheat. There was enough for everybody. The families, everybody was working to provide for their needs, and they had marvelous festivals and so on. And he was amazed. He says, "We don't have any poor here."
He was not ashamed.
No. And then she said 8 years later, she heard this same young man talking to an American tourist. By this time, tourism, they had begun to improve the economy, you see, by encouraging foreign tourism and going after the foreign lifestyle and opening up their borders. This is supposed to be opportunity. And she heard him saying, the same young man, to one of these tourists, "Oh, we are so poor. You've got to help us. We need so many things." And she was so struck by this. Here was this man who 8 years ago couldn't find anybody poor in his village. And now he's saying to this outsider, "We're so poor, we have nothing. You people have to send stuff for us." And it made me think about the perception of poverty and how many of the problems we have today have to do with some of this.
Yes.
Maybe it made me think of the Garden of Eden and the story of Adam and Eve, and God looking for Adam, and he couldn't find Adam that day because they had eaten the fruit, and Adam was now nowhere to be found. And finally when God said, "Why are you hiding?" Adam said, "I was naked and I hid." And God said, "Who told you that you were naked?" And I thought, in substitute for that Adam discovers suddenly he's poor. Adam, who has been living in this garden, Adam and Eve, fairly happily, whatever this thing is that introduces change into their life, which would be, as if in the context of what we are discussing, a foreign definition of who you are and of what your needs are. And suddenly, he's hiding now. He can't meet God on an equal footing anymore. I was poor and I hid. And that God would say, "Who told you that you were poor?" And the end of the story is that you lose the Garden of Eden.
You're right.
So, you know, it came to me at that point.
Yes.
That there are so many things that if we look creatively, we can find some of these new definitions.
And also I think you're saying that we have to get back to our own stories in order to get back to our own ground. And to lose this sense of alienation and shame that has come down to us from foreign stories, from other people's stories, from taking on other people's stories.
And not that we necessarily want to exclude the wisdom of other people, because I think myths are the most powerful truths that we have, and we can all learn from one another's myths, I think, eventually. But first we have to know who we are.
Yes.
And I think that's where one's early experiences have to be validated. And we being authentic is so important. And sometimes I look at some of the problems facing some of the newly independent countries that are ex-colonies, and so often it has to do with the chains of colonialism, the fact that they spent so many years letting somebody else define even what you eat, you know.
Yes.
People, for instance, who had a very healthy diet, say on millet, and because it didn't suit the colonial power to have them grow millet, they were growing something else. The land was commandeered to produce something that was needed by the metropolitan powers in Europe, and then food would be, they would then have to buy food instead of growing the millet, which we all know is a perfectly healthy grain.
Yes.
And they had been eating it for hundreds of years in certain parts of Africa.
Yes.
Instead, they have given that up for white bread.
Yes.
So in so many ways, we have lost so much that took so long to acquire.
That took so long, that essence that took so long to acquire.
And it's a painful process, rediscovering.
Remembering it.
And remembering.
Yes.
And
here we are in Canada, so many of us, so many groups, all engaged in the same process in Canada. I wonder, is that the Canadian story?
Well, I think Canada is a wonderful place at this time in that there are so many different strands coming together, and it's wonderful to be in a place where it hasn't gelled and frozen yet.
Yes.
And you can be part of whatever is evolving, because I think we've had problems. There are those who would like to have a blueprint for what the end result has got to be. But I really think that they are in the minority. And I don't think having blueprints is the way to evolve a culture. And it's open. As Gandhi once said, I like my house to be open, and I like the winds of all cultures to blow through my house. Mm-hmm. And I feel that we in Canada have a great opportunity to have something really special with all these strands that are coming together, starting with our Aboriginal peoples and the wonderful wisdom and spirituality and the relationship with the environment that they have had that goes back for so many centuries. And then the various groups that came from Europe and from Asia and from Africa and from Latin America and from Eastern Europe now. It all goes for a very exciting ferment, I think.
And you're quite positive that all these stories can be knitted up into one big pattern.
I think so. I think we've got to be open about that.
And your sense is that we have to put back into the stories those of us who are missing.
Yes, I think we've got to everybody has to belong. Mm. And I think that it's not easy. In so many districts, people are working at creating an environment in which people feel free to be who they are. On the other hand, one leaves behind certain things, and we come together into a new country. I certainly think that some of the old conflicts from the old worlds that we left behind can well be left behind.
Yes, yes.
I don't think we need to bring them.
Yes.
Granted, it's not as easily said as done, but I think that one can dwell too much and pass on to the generation that is to come some of the bitterness of the past.
Yes, the unresolved conflicts.
Yes, and there is a sense too, of course, in which one has to know one's history to make sure one doesn't repeat some of the mistakes of the past.
Yes, and I think that there is a sense also that we're allowed to be sad about our history, and I think sadness is appropriate.
Yes, but for instance. There are times when you have a conflict between culture, say, and a certain understanding that is already fairly set that we in Canada have come to about a human rights code. Yes. I have no ambivalence at all about where to stand when there is any conflict between what we accept as a human rights code and culture. I think culture at times can be a sacred cow.
Yes.
For instance, this has come up in the question of female circumcision.
Yes.
And I feel very strongly about it. I don't care how old the practice is, and I don't care how time-honored it is, and which great African leader said what about it. you come to Canada, it's against our human rights code, and we will not put up with it.
Yes.
So, you know, I think there are times, it's a very fine line. And, you know, what you accept and honor and respect, and what you take a firm stand on and refuse to compromise on. It's not easy.
Yes,
but
we bring our stuff with us,
Mm-hmm.
and then we integrate it into Canada or wherever we are right now. But that doesn't mean that we reify it, that we carve it into huge blocks of stone
right.
that we're then crucified on
right,
for the
yes.
future generations.
Exactly.
It's, as you say, thank goodness to be in a place where everything is a little more fluid.
That's right, yes.
And that's where we are with these stories in Canada.
Yes.
They're still open-ended.
They are still open-ended, and I think that's what's great about it.
Well, Wilma, I wish we could talk more. I'd love to hear more of your stories. I love the ones that you did about the Greek myths. For the first time, I felt that I was in a Greek myth.
Well, it was quite interesting when I thought that I had a reasonably classical education in which I grew up on those myths to some extent. I mean, I read them in Latin. I used to teach Latin, you know, once, in a past life.
A lively language.
Yes. And for some reason, I never had come across this particular myth, and I came across it in a very obscure reference, and I started tracking it down and discovered it was a most wonderful story about a young man who was, Ovid says, profane, and he was determined to cut down the largest oak in a grove of trees that was sacred to Ceres.
Yes, I think that's the story that we'll come back to our next interview on. That's the really good story.
And so I found what struck me about it was, why was this story suppressed? One almost feels that it was suppressed because the message is very relevant.
Yes.
And it's one of those stories that we could all do with.
Suppressed by, as so many of the stories were.
That's right, yes, and one wonders why.
Well, I think Nanaimo is very lucky, and the school children in Nanaimo were very lucky to have you come in there as lady storyteller, grandmother storyteller. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it.